Hello and welcome to Writing America, Pages and People. If you're here to learn about an American author and some of their works, then you're in the right place. My name is Rachel Rigolino, and I'm an instructor in the English department at the State University of New York at New Paltz. So come on, we'll watch this video and leave some comments below.
Willa Cather was born in 1873 in Virginia, but moved as a young girl to Nebraska, an area one biographer described as being, in the late 19th century, quote, a raw land of red grass plains and scattered railroad towns. Cather once observed that, quote, most of the basic material a writer works with is acquired before the age of 15. And the western landscape in which Cather was raised appears in many of her novels and short stories. Indeed, Red Cloud, Nebraska bills itself as America's best-known small town because of its appearance in so much of Cather's work. Willa Cather wrote much of her fiction during the period around World War I, an unsettled time of great progress but also destruction and cultural upheaval. Critics such as Harold Bloom have spoken of Cather's quote-unquote nostalgic vision, populated by her childhood memories of immigrant farmers wresting a living on the prairie and beautifully portrayed in novels such as My Ántonia and O Pioneers. In fact, these are two fantastic novels that have become a part of the American canon. However, any tendency towards sentimentality or romanticism is tempered by the contemporary world of Cather's adulthood, a world of industrial growth, loss of faith, and of course, World War. One critic has noted that Cather often portrayed artists in conflict, wrestling between the sophisticated allure of the East and the freedom and earthy simplicity of the West. This tension is apparent, for example, in her story A Death in the Desert. In early adulthood, Cather left the western plains and high desert behind and moved east. She wound up working first in Pittsburgh as a journalist and high school teacher, and later at McClure's magazine in New York. Her short story, Paul's Case, is set in Pittsburgh, and Cather later said that the Paul of the story was inspired, at least in part, by one of her students. In 1923, Cather received the Pulitzer Prize for her novel One of Ours. Interestingly, today this novel is much less read than her earlier works such as My Ántonia and O Pioneers. One of Ours chronicles the life of a disaffected Nebraska farmer, Claude Wheeler, who finds his life's purpose as a soldier in World War I. Cather based her character of Claude on a cousin who was killed in France during the war. What follows is an excerpt from a documentary about Willa Cather's life, and it looks at her young years as a college student and then moving to Pittsburgh, where of course she set her short story, Paul's Case. So let's take a look.
I'm quite sure she didn't want to live a life like her mother's. I'm very certain of that.
When she was 14, Willa Cather reinvented herself for the whole town to see.
Willa went to the local barber and had her hair cut off. She got a crew cut. She wore suspenders, she wore a derby, she strode about in a mannish fashion. Cather was trying to get attention and give a message about herself. I'm going to be different. I'm going to have a real life. I'm going to have an exciting life. And the first step is I'm going to be a guy.
Cather experimented with her new persona. In local theater productions, she usually chose the male role. She played the merchant father in Beauty and the Beast to enthusiastic reviews. She took to wearing a Confederate cap in honor of her uncle who had died fighting for the South at Manassas. She decided she wanted to become a doctor and began signing her letters William Cather, M.D.
The town had 2 doctors, and they were very important people, and they were both very kind to Willa Cather, and you wouldn't find that nowadays. They took her out in their buggies when they went on house calls. They let her help.
She was given the great gift of not being told who she was or how she was to be. She was given the great gift of that Nebraska blankness, of the plains, in which she didn't go through a proscribed kind of education, a proscribed kind of family life. Everything was contested. Everything was up for grabs. Everything was new.
Red Cloud was a raw prairie town, but it valued culture as much as any big city. Traveling road shows performed regularly at the Opera House on Main Street, and Willa Cather attended nearly every performance. She said she didn't care if a play or musical was good or bad, as long as it fired the imagination.
There would be flyers about, and then she would go and she would wait for the curtain to rise, and it would be a world within world.
I can remember as a child coming home from the ballet or the theater, and you go into your room and you are beside yourself.
Cather shared the second floor of the house with 4 younger brothers. She always remembered the attic as a private space, where there were no older people poking about to spoil things. Willa was the only one with a room of her own, a tiny bedroom.
I think that Cather had a very clear sense of a very, very rich world beyond her individual life, beyond Red Cloud, beyond herself, and that she was so hungry for it, that she wanted it so much.
Cather, as a child, was desperate to grow up to have an interesting life. She wanted power. She wanted to do things, have great adventures. She read everything. She read Carlyle. She read Shakespeare. She adored Kipling. She read the Romantic poets. Cather was an extraordinarily intelligent person. She was not a normal person. Not just intelligent, but intensely, intensely curious.
When she was only 16, Willa Cather left Red Cloud for college in the state capital of Lincoln. Her parents made a sacrifice to pay for her education, and from the minute she left home, they knew she wasn't coming back. In 1890, Cather arrived at the University of Nebraska with big ambitions and no idea of the painful struggle that lay ahead. She chose to major in science, but changed her mind when a teacher published one of her essays in the Lincoln newspaper. "Up to that time, I thought I would like to study medicine," she wrote. "But what youthful vanity can be unaffected by the sight of itself in print? It was a kind of hypnotic effect."
I think she realized quite soon, and her excellent professors let her know, that she could have a life. She could have a life as a writer. She could have a life in the arts.
In her junior year, Cather became managing editor of the campus magazine, The Hesperian. Years later, one of her colleagues remembered, "The truth is, The Hesperian was Willa. The rest of us looked wise and did nothing." She filled the magazine with her own short stories, plays, and essays, including one on the poetry of football.
It makes one exceedingly weary to hear people object to football because it is brutal. Of course it is brutal. So is Homer brutal and Tolstoy. The moment that, as a nation, we lose brute force or an admiration for brute force, from that moment, poetry and art are forever dead among us, and we will have nothing but grammar and mathematics left.
She wrote theater reviews for the local newspapers, earning $1 a column, enough to cover room and board. Willa Cather earned a reputation as a fearsome critic. Her editor was impressed. "Many an actor wondered on coming to Lincoln," he said, what would appear the next morning from the pen of that meat-axe young girl.
Mediocrity is of all things the most hopeless. That is what is the matter with Lewis Morrison. He is fairly good. Miss Effie Ellsler is a well-meaning little woman with an impossible little nose, an irritating placidity of manner, and a shrill domestic little stage shriek that is suggestive of mice.
I think she was a very opinionated young person. She had an idea of how she wanted La Boheme to be sung. And she hadn't seen so many productions that she wasn't still a little bit shocked that it didn't meet all her expectations. She was young.
I hear someone very smart and very independent. And also, before we had the term cultural critic, that's what she was. Many of those pieces talked about the way people in Lincoln didn't dress properly for the occasion.
But as critical as she was, Cather knew greatness when she saw it. She compared a performance by Sarah Bernhardt to a flash of lightning, gone before you see enough of it, and indescribable in its brilliancy. By the time she graduated, Willa Cather looked nothing like the boyish girl who had arrived in Lincoln from Red Cloud 5 years before. But her ambition burned hot as ever. She couldn't wait to get out of Nebraska, she said. She was afraid of being buried in a cornfield. In 1896, she made her break. She took a job in Pittsburgh, editing a ladies' magazine called The Home Monthly. It paid the rent, but left her dissatisfied. "There is no God but one God, and art is his revealer," Cather wrote to a friend. "That's my creed, and I'll follow it to the end, to a hotter place than Pittsburgh, if need be." Pittsburgh was indeed hot with smoke and dirt from steel and iron mills. But the wealth that industry created brought the finest art and music to the city. Cather was dazzled, a girl from Nebraska on the outside looking in. But the door to wealth and privilege opened sooner than she expected. She met the daughter of a judge, a young woman named Isabelle McClung.
She was beautiful, graceful, extraordinarily flattered and impressed by Cather's intelligence and talent, and they fitted each other's fantasies perfectly.
I think probably Isabelle taught her how to shop, how to dress, how to be elegant, how to be a beautiful woman. It freed her to love women and to love herself as a woman.
Isabelle invited Willa to move in with her family and gave her a room of her own, a small sewing room where she could write.
Well, this is priceless, to be nurtured and appreciated in that way. And, I think it also suggests to us how lonely Cather had been and how lonely she had to be to get as far as she had.
In 1902, Willa and Isabelle traveled to Europe. For the first time, Cather saw the places she knew only from books. She loved France above all. French literature, food, and culture would forever be her ideal.
The two of them enjoyed each other's company, traveled together. They made a life together happen that would have been impossible for either one of them alone. We are so narrow in our definitions of love, and I think it was absolutely love.
Cather said that she wrote all of her books for Isabelle. But since both women burned their letters, their relationship remains mysterious.
We don't know whether Cather and Isabelle were lovers. And Indeed, we don't know whether Cather ever had a lover in the sense that we define that. In other words, somebody she went to bed with. If Cather was, in fact, homosexual, then that's important because it means that she had a very strong force in her life that was anathematized by the society.
There is not a word in a word she has written that gives us the impression that this woman had firsthand knowledge of sexual passion. There is nothing she has ever written that makes you feel she understands what goes on between men and women or even between homosexual lovers.
For me, sex is not the word. For me, it's the erotic. And I think it was an erotic relationship with Isabelle. I think it was a fully erotic and loving, deeply human relationship of two women celebrating themselves as women together, undoubtedly in a private world of their own.
By 1903, Cather saw her first book in print, April Twilights, a collection of her poems. 2 years later, a book of her short stories was published by S.S. McClure of the famous McClure's magazine in New York City. McClure was impressed with Cather's talent, and he offered her a job. But first, she would have to say goodbye to the comfortable life she had found in Pittsburgh with Isabelle and her family.
In closing, it should be noted that although Cather lived in New York for the rest of her life and traveled to Europe as a journalist and as a writer, she often returned to Red Cloud and the West that she loved. Quote, "There was nothing but land," the narrator in My Ántonia says of the wide open landscape. Not a country at all, but the material out of which countries are made.